Now, let's turn back again, shall we? I'm not sure if you worked out the conundrum that Matthew shared with you, but no doubt he will explain more next week. But it's an interesting one, isn't it? Only an Irishman could probably get away with it. But let's turn to Ecclesiastes 5 and verse 1 to verse 7. Ecclesiastes chapter 5, verse 1 to verse 7. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Go near to listen, rather than to offer the sacrifice of fools, who do not know that they do wrong. Do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. As a dream comes when there are many cares, so the speech of a fool when there are many words. When you make a vow to God, do not delay in fulfilling it. He has no pleasure in fools. Fulfill your vow. It is better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth lead you into sin, and do not protest to the temple messenger, my vow was a mistake. Why should God be angry at what you say and destroy the work of your hands? Much dreaming and many words are meaningless. Therefore, stand in awe of God. And there we finish. And we pray God's special blessing on his word again this afternoon. I'm sure all of you probably realize by now, as you've worked your way slowly but surely through Ecclesiastes, that it's right there in what we often refer to as the wisdom literature of the Old Testament. And in a sense, the underlying message of Ecclesiastes is, to you and to me this afternoon in Hillbank, be wise, or rather, wise up. And so when you look at the chapter we're thinking about today, it reminds us one more time, doesn't it, that the overall theme of this particular book is all about answering the big questions in your life and in mine. It's all about handling the tough issues that we often come across. And I think, having so far covered the first 3 chapters and a big chunk of chapter 5 and 6 today, we've had our fair share of them, haven't we? But the good news is, if you want to see it like that, the end is not yet. Now, having said that, what we have right here in the opening paragraph or two in chapter 5 is what I would call a cool oasis. And it's right there in the middle of a hot, dry desert. And I think these 7 verses give us a wonderful opportunity to think one more time about worship and what worship really means in your life and in mine. You see what the teacher has been doing? He's taken a lot of time, he's taken a fair bit of trouble, and he's been scraping away that veneer of an empty, formal religion. Why has he done that? Well, he wants to show you and I the value of a relationship with God. He wants to remind us that we have something to appreciate, enjoy, something meaningful about a dynamic, vibrant relationship with God. And I think the final sentence down there in verse 7 is one that is breathtaking in its simplicity, and yet it's so comprehensive in its magnitude. It's where the preacher man says, therefore, in other words, after all the talking, therefore stand in awe of God. I think it was the American evangelist A.W. Tozer who said on one memorable occasion that worship was the missing jewel in the evangelical church. Well, the teacher right here in chapter 5, he shows us what we're missing in these handful of verses. And I think if we handle them correctly this afternoon, he wants to whet our appetite. He wants to encourage you and I to rediscover just the vibrancy and the vitality of what it really does mean to genuinely worship the Lord. It's not the kind of thing you expect to read in the heart of the Old Testament, is it? In so many ways, these verses, they come to you and to me as a kind of a shock to the system. They're not the kind of thing you really expect to find in this book of all books. You see, up until now, the writer has been primarily concerned with the reality of what's going on in this world in which we all live. Indeed, the world back in his day as well. It's the world, if you like, outside the four walls of a church. Now you see what he's doing, in a sense. He's stepping inside the four walls of a church. As it were, he's meeting a local congregation of gospel people, and he wants to see for himself what really is happening within the sanctuary of the Lord. Now, I think it goes without saying, does it not? But he really hasn't been much enthused or overly impressed with what he has perceived to be taking place in the world all around him. If anything, look at chapters 1, 2, and 3, and again the chunk that we had today. It's actually left him reeling, hasn't it? Almost on the edge of despair, wringing his hands in horror. He has a feeling that he really ain't going anywhere too fast. Hence the phrase popping up with remarkable frequency, meaningless, meaningless, meaningless. Now my question today is this. I just wonder, what will be his first impression when he pays a visit to the house of God? What comments can we expect to hear from him after he's been in there and seen it all for himself? What insights will he have to share with you and I this afternoon as he tells us, like it is, from his angle, from his perspective? The one thing we can be certain of today, as you've discovered already, is that he will never ever pull the wool over your eyes or over mine. He will call a spade a spade. He will not label it as a sharp-edged gardening implement. No, there's no playing around with words with a teacher in this particular book. And so 3 main lines of thought we have this afternoon. Take a look at verse 1, where he's talking there about our approach. He talks about our approach. He says down there in verse 1, that you and I ought to be men and women who guard our steps when we go to the house of God. Now, I have no idea who does the church's Facebook page, but somebody actually took that little verse and put it up on the church Facebook page, and it really encapsulates so well what the writer's talking about here. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. What does that mean? Well, it means quite literally what it says. We ought to watch our step. Now, obviously, he wasn't thinking about a church as we know a church today. He had in the front of his mind the temple when he wrote these particular words. He could visualize in his mind's eye the vast crowds of worshippers going up to that magnificent building every single day. They were going there to do what they had to do, but they were also going there to do what they felt they needed to do. If you know anything about the temple back then, it was stunning, absolutely stunning in its beauty. It was vast in its size. It was incredibly appealing to the eye in terms of its architecture and design. One look, you stood back, mouth open wide. It was decorated, it has to be said, with nothing but the finest and the very best. So quite literally, the temple, it was out of this world. It could be described as an amazing sight. Seen it once, you would never ever forget it. It actually left you speechless and in many ways spellbound. And as you went to the temple, and as you saw it, you actually felt rather tiny, rather insignificant. You felt a tad small. And that was intentional, wasn't it? Because it meant that your eyes would turn heavenward to one who is almighty, the one that we talked about this morning, the one who is El Shaddai. You see, people with a heart for the Lord, they would be overwhelmed with that real sense of humility before it. And they would be lost in a sense of wonder when they contemplated all that the temple and the sacrificial system actually stood for. But look, friends, the fact that this was the house of God, It's a place where God would meet with his people. It's a place where God would dwell. It's a place where God could be found. And so all of those truths combine to powerfully remind us that God longs for his people to worship him. And he longs for his people to worship him in a way and in a manner that will delight him and that will give him pleasure. And that's why he so succinctly says down there in verse 1, the opening injunction, guard your steps. You know, my friend, that is straight from the shoulder advice, isn't it? In other words, if we're going to worship the living God, we must do it on his terms. Here is the God who has set out the ground rules, as it were. And I tell you, the man's a fool if he doesn't follow them. And then the teacher goes on in verse 1 to say, he says there's a right way to do it, there's a proper way to do it. You see, we must never, ever forget when we're entering into the house of God, that we're entering into the presence of one who is so great, one who is, as we were singing, so holy, 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 one who is so awesome, so majestic, so powerful. We just can't come into his house any old way. We just dare not come in the way that we want to do it. And it seems to me he's underlining here for your benefit and mine that preparation of heart, preparation of mind is of supreme importance. You know, there's nothing casual about it at all. It's not a matter of you and I dropping by and popping in, as it were, to say a quick hello. Something like this. Hello, Lord. How are you today? No. That's not the kind of thing he has in the front of his mind. In fact, the very wise teacher in Ecclesiastes 5 in verse 1, he pulls no punches, does he? When he says rather bluntly that the less we say, the better. Now, that's hard to take sometimes, isn't it? But that's the bluntness of what he's saying. And the truth is, and the reality is, dear friends, that so often you and I are so busy talking and waffling on, that this God who rules and reigns on high, he is the one who is often sidelined. You and I are doing so much of the talking that, if you like, God can't get a word in edgeways. And so often in your life and mine, as we gather together, we want to monopolize the conversation. And to all intents and purposes, it very quickly becomes a one-way communication. It seems to me, when I take to heart what he says down there in verse 1, that it's probably helpful if we avoid so much of the idle chit-chat that goes on even before a service commences. Why do I say that? Because that's the best time for you and I to be fine-tuning our spiritual senses ere we gather to hear from him. I think sometimes we miss out big time because we haven't come with that full preparedness of heart and of mind. And so that when the moment comes, God speaks, we're actually ready to hear what the Lord is saying to us. In fact, I take it a step further, and maybe it says something of my vintage or whatever, I do not know. But it seems to me the ideal preparation for worship on a Lord's Day, both morning and evening, actually begins on the Saturday, ere we come up to the house of God. You see, we need to make sure, don't we, dear friends, that your heart, your mind, my heart, my mind, we need to make sure that we're on the divine wavelength. Otherwise, we turn up and we're wasting our time. Because if we're not in the same wavelength as what he happens to be on, it defeats the real purpose of you and I being gathered together in his name to worship him in the house of the Lord. Sure, we're here, and that's great. It won't do us any harm. Absolutely not. But you know something? It won't do us as much good as potentially it could do. And I think that's why the teacher challenges every one of us there in chapter 5 and verse 1. He says, go near to listen. Go near to listen. You see, dear friends, we draw near and we listen well. Why? Because we're ready, we're prepared, and God is communicating with us. You and I get as close as we can so that we can hear his heartbeat, so that we become au fait with what's very much on his mind. And so the teacher is saying in chapter 5 and verse 1, we need to be men and women who, as we gather to worship, we need to be alert and attentive as we anticipate hearing the voice of God speaking to us. And then if you take a look at verse 2 and verse 3, there he talks about our attitude. It's all about our attitude. You know, he's more or less calling us down there in those couple of verses. He's telling us to be quiet. He's telling us to stay calm. Why? Because of two reasons. Number one, this God is a God who hears the inaudible. But it's also a God, number two, who sees the invisible. Now, in today's speak, what does that mean? Well, for you and for me, it means that we would be far, far better off keeping our big mouths shut. That's what he's saying. At the end of the day, friends, most of us, speaker included, have far, far too much to say. We do. But there are times in your life and mine, as we gather to worship him, there are times, there are moments when it's wiser to say naught. And this happens to be one of those special occasions. And I'm just so glad the teacher gives us a perfectly valid reason for saying what he does. But you know, he doesn't leave it there, does he? He goes on to explain his thinking behind it. Here is the divine rationale. He says down there in verse 2, do not be quick with your mouth. Do not be hasty in your heart to utter anything before God. Let your words be few. Now, whoever the teacher happens to be that penned this amazingly insightful book of Ecclesiastes, he knows what we are like, doesn't he? He knows that most of us, we come rushing into worship, we're full of ourselves, we have our own agenda, we have our own ideas, bright ones, big ones, sure. We have our own thoughts as what we want to get out of the time of worship. Sure, we come before him, don't we, with our burdens and our concerns that often weigh us down. But by the same token, we also have our own aspirations and even our desires. And basically, when we gather together, we want the worship experience to be something which gives us a buzz. We want to feel better at the end of it. We want to enjoy something that leaves us feeling good, something that will boost our morale. But you know, look what he says. That isn't what the Bible calls worship. That's actually putting the cart before the horse. Because true worship isn't about me and what I can get out of it. True worship is all about him. It's about him. And true worship in your heart and mine means that we bring everything to him. And we leave it all at his feet so that we might discover his perspective on the situation, so that you and I might be instructed by his truth, so that we might be directed clearly by his word, so that ultimately you and I might be able to bring our lives into harmony with his perfect will. Now, that's not just good Old Testament theology and thinking. In fact, when you fast forward to Romans 12, that's the gist of what Paul talks about there as well, isn't it? In fact, Paul goes further and says, this is the logical, it's the reasonable thing to do. The first couple of verses in that wonderful chapter. Well, you say to me, okay, Sam, but what's the big deal? Well, you see again what the writer does in chapter 5. He now clears the air. And he tells us down there in verse 3, doesn't he, that the reason why we should do all of this and toe his party line is because, what does it say? Middle of verse 2, God is in heaven and we are on earth. That's it, my friends. It's as simple, as profound as that. I mean, God is God. Yeah. And man is man. And I tell you, there's a world of difference between he and you and me. A world of difference between heaven and earth. And you know, think about it, dear friends. Think about it. God is everything that we are not, and still some. Here is one who is infinite. We're finite. Here is one who is immortal, and we're mortal. Here is one who is eternal, and yet you and I were bound by time. Here is one who is invisible, and yet we are visible. Here is one who is spirit, and what are we? We're flesh. Here is one who is omnipotent, all-powerful, and yet you and I are marked and characterized by weakness. Here is one who is thrice times holy, but for you and I, we are sinners, dyed-in-the-wool sinners. He is pure, and we are impure. Here is one who knows all there is to know. He is omniscient, and we're ignorant. Here is one who is unchangeable, and we're fickle. He's faithful. We're unfaithful. He is loving. And at best for you and for me, we only know something of partial love. He is everywhere at the same moment, omnipresent. But for you and me, well, we're here right now, aren't we? And in half an hour's time, we'll be somewhere different, one place at a time. You see, it goes back to what I said a few minutes ago, doesn't it? This God of whom I speak, he's a God who sees the invisible, but it's a God who hears the inaudible. We can't fool God. We can't pull the wool over his eyes. God can read us like a book. He can see right through us, can't he? Now, we may dot our I's and we may cross our T's. But hey, guys, he knows all there is to know about every single one of us. Here is a God who is not influenced, remotely influenced with you and I using all the right-sounding words or even by our lengthy prayers. Other people around us may be very impressed, but not necessarily our God in heaven. I read a rather perceptive comment a little while ago. I've never forgotten it, but this is what it said. We don't pray into a spiritual microphone with God listening on a set of heavenly earphones. No. God listens to us pray with a spiritual stethoscope. And that's it, isn't it? And the bottom line is, we may even put on a good show, but we can't fool God. You know, but do you and I a lot of good, I'm sure, if we had a spare few minutes, to actually glance through the scriptures and just to reflect on many of the so-called great prayers that are recorded there for us. Remember Abraham, Genesis chapter 18, Solomon, 2 Chronicles, Nehemiah in chapter 1, my buddy Daniel in chapter 9, the early Christians in Acts chapter 4. I mean, you read them and all of them give us quite an insight into what real prayer is all about. It's a matter for the heart. That's what he says right there in chapter 5, isn't it? You see, when you and I analyze their prayers, we very quickly realize that so often you and I don't get it quite right. We're big in asking, aren't we? And we're oftentimes little on worship. I have a lesson to learn there, as I'm sure many of you do as well. These guys of whom I've mentioned already, they were minimal in their requests, but they maximized their celebration of the character of God. That's the difference. And when they did ask the Lord for anything, do you know what? It was always saturated. It was soaked in what God is like. And it seems to me that's the reason why they could pray with such faith. That's the reason why their prayers were answered in amazing ways. And maybe even today, you and I need a fresh vision, even a glimpse of the one of whom the teacher says, in chapter 5 is in heaven. Now, in very many ways, the person who wrote this wonderful book is a good preacher. Because having made his point and driven it home, you see what he does now? He goes back in verse 3 to elucidate on the matter a second time. Why does he do that? Because he knows we sometimes don't get a first time. And he wants to remind us a second time around. He wants to ensure there are no grey areas in our thinking and in our understanding of real worship. So he says down there, doesn't he, in verse 2 and again in verse 3, he says, you can almost measure how big a fool someone is by the many words that they use. The quicker the words tumble out, the greater the fool the speaker is likely to be. For you and for me, the lesson is quite simple. We need to think before we talk. Now, I'm sure all of us know people who could talk the leg of a proverbial stool and talk it back on again. We know people like that, don't we? But it's patently obvious in the context of 2 and 3 that such verbose individuals, they've often mastered the art of saying an awful lot and yet saying nothing at the same time. And it would appear that some of us actually love to hear ourselves talking. We just enjoy the sound of our own voice, don't we, sometimes? And someone has said that such words, they just flow out like water pouring over the Niagara Falls. And I think the red lights are flashing right here in the teacher's mind in chapter 5, because the danger is that your worship and mine could be in the very same mold. There's the danger. And if it is, we have mega problems. You see, worship is so much more than words. It was the author of Pilgrim's Progress. It was John Bunyan who wrote on one occasion, in prayer, it is better to have a heart without words than words without a heart. That's not only true of prayer. That's true of the context we have in chapter 5. The same principle applies to worship. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the name William Temple. He was the former Archbishop of Canterbury, and he gives us a brilliant definition of worship. He says that worship is to quicken the conscience by the holiness of God. It is to feed the mind with the truth of God. It's to purge the imagination by the beauty of God. It's to open up the heart to the love of God. It's to devote the will to the purpose of God, and all of that gathered up in adoration. I was quite intrigued to find the teacher here in chapter 5 doesn't only hit out against our abundance of words, but he also pulls the carpet from under your feet and mine in relation to dreams. You see what he says down there in verse 3? He says, as a dream comes when there are many cares. Do you know, again, the old preacher, he's earth to reality, isn't he? He knows fine well what goes on in the mind of the average person when they gather to worship. Now, come on, folks, we all do a wee bit of daydreaming, don't we? I think we do. And no matter how absorbing the worship is, and no matter how attentive or alert we try to be, no matter how meaningful the whole experience is, sometimes, for me anyway, our minds can wander all too easily. Sure, we stand and sing. We go through the motions in offering praise unto the Lord. But ask us 5 minutes later what we've just been singing. And most of us probably wouldn't have a clue, would we? And that's not only true for the singing, that's certainly true for the preaching of the word as well, because your mind and mine is often on other issues. We're maybe thinking about some unfinished job around the house, or maybe wondering what's on the menu for Sunday lunch or after the service. So many things come in, detract us from worshipping. It's so easy for you and I to listen and not to hear. It's so easy for you and I to sing and not to praise. It's so easy for you and for me to go through the motions and not really be present. I mean, how often do we spend time sitting wherever, counting the pipes in the organ, not hard to do for this one, at the front of the church, or looking up and counting the light bulbs and all the rest of it? You know, somebody called it one day verbal doodling. I mean, smile. But there are moments in your life and mine when we gather just like this. And we're in a wee world of our own, aren't we? See what he says down there in verse 7. He says that much dreaming and many words are meaningless. You know, there comes a time when we gather for worship that we really need to let go of concerns. We need to let go of our anxieties and our worries, and that's not minimizing them in any way at all. Our preoccupations, we need to shelve them when we enter into the presence of the Lord. You know, there's just a lot to be said, isn't there? For you and I just being still in the presence of God and allowing him to minister to us by his Spirit, through his word, into your heart and mind, which may be troubled for one reason or another. Our attitude. And then finally down there in verse 4, 5 and 6, it challenges us regarding our actions. Our actions. You know, it's very interesting, these words, aren't they? The hot potato we're talking about here, I suppose, is one which has burned many of our fingers in days gone past. You know, we can identify with the danger, can't we? I certainly can, because we've fallen into the trap at one point or another. You know, sometimes we gather to worship or whatever, and we're caught up in the emotion of a moment, when the atmosphere has been so highly charged, and we've really felt the warmth and the closeness of the presence of God. And what have we sometimes done? In the heat of that moment, we have often made promises to God. And then a few days later, when that glow has evaporated, we sometimes backtrack on what we said, and we fail to deliver. At the time, we really meant every word that we said. We were sincere, we were honest, we were genuine. But you see, dear friends, there's a problem. We're the ones who said it, aren't we? We spoke those words with all earnestness. We made the promise. And once a promise is made, it should never, ever be broken. And that simply underlines it, reinforces the argument the teacher is making right here in these 2 or 3 verses. You know, it can happen so easily, can't it? We've heard a stirring sermon on world mission. Yeah? So we promise that we will go to the ends of the earth for the sake of extending the kingdom of God. We've been challenged about our lack of giving to the work of the Lord. So we promise the Lord from the end of this month that we'll give him 1/10 of all that we earn. Your heart and mine has sometimes been tugged by an overwhelming sense of compassion for people in a crisis, in a great need. And we promise the Lord we'll do our best to alleviate that situation in one way or another. We've been convinced for the umpteenth time about some form of temptation that we give into over and over again, and we resolve in our hearts, Lord, I'll never do it again. Sometimes we've been challenged about the chip we have on our shoulder against a fellow believer, so we determine as soon as the benediction's pronounced, I'll hunt them out and I'll say I'm sorry. And then we have that lovely music playing. Abba, Father, let me be yours and yours alone. And that's captivated our hearts, hasn't it? And in a silent prayer, we've said, yes, Father, I'm yours. I surrender all. Isn't that what often happens? It is, dear friends. But then within 2 or 3 days, we feel a tad different. Sometimes we hedge our missionary commitment with all sorts of terms and conditions. Even a year out would be too much of a hassle, or it wouldn't really be worth it. Sometimes we wriggle out of our commitment to tithe our salary, our incomings. Why? Because the bills just keep coming. The credit card payments seem to be getting more and more every month. Sometimes we're too busy to juggle our diary and rearrange our social schedule to get out there, to get involved in some kind of gospel ministry. We face that particular temptation, whatever it may be. It looks so attractive and so appealing that we give in. And then to make matters worse, we actually enjoy doing it. And we don't feel that bad. We make the excuse sometimes, don't we, that we couldn't find our Christian brother or sister after the meeting was over to apologize. And so in the ordinary, everyday pressures of your life and of mine, we conveniently forget that we are the Lord's and the Lord's alone. You see what's happening, dear friends? And it's right there. The teacher told us all about it. The promises we make in haste, we often repent of at leisure. We say we didn't quite mean it. No one else heard it. And that God would understand. The question is, will he? Look again what the writer says down there. I tell you, folks, he doesn't leave too much ground for maneuver. There's not much wriggle room, is there? Not much room for negotiation. He says, come off it, guys. You've made a promise. You've made a vow. Get your act together. I think there are two bits of advice he has for all those who have defaulted on their promise. In verse 4, we have no option but to deliver the goods. He said, look, folks, you said it. You've got to carry it through. You didn't have to do it, but you did it. Now, says the text, do not delay in fulfilling it. And I think the lesson for every one of us today is glaringly obvious. Say what you mean. Mean what you say. Otherwise, if we're going to go back on our word, you'd be better off saying nothing. That's why he says quite categorically down there in verse 5 that it's better not to vow than to make a vow and not fulfill it. That's a challenge, isn't it? And then see down there in verse 6, again he makes it ever so plain that we should never try to talk our way out of it. You know, the old teacher is wise. He tries to get us to understand the seriousness of what we have done. He says, we've offended the Lord. And here is the one who is truth on two legs. One who always tells the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And no matter how well-intentioned we were, no matter how we felt at that particular moment in time, he says if we make a vow and fail to keep it, we're actually guilty of telling a lie to the Lord. And he's holy. And he's righteous. And he'll hold us to account for all that we say, won't he? Thank God today, dear friends, we can make amends. We can make amends by confessing our sin, our hastiness in what we said, in making that promise. And in his mercy and in his grace, he will forgive us. He will not hold it against us. He will restore us. He will enable us to start afresh with him. The God that we read of here in chapter 5 is the God of the second chance. And so let's learn the lesson ever so well. Let's not rush in where angels fear to tread. Let's rather be still in his presence. And as the teacher says at the end of the section, stand in awe of God. My dear friends, that's what real worship is all about. Not about me, not about anyone here, but it's all about him. May God help us. Amen.